If you lived in a rich estate in Nigeria, you would wonder if it was heaven on earth. The streets were swept every morning before the sun rose, and the flowers that lined the wide paved roads stood as if each petal had been instructed not to bend carelessly. Security men in crisp uniforms guarded the gates, greeting with polished salutes that reminded visitors they were stepping into a world far removed from the ordinary struggles of the city. The houses were not mere shelters. They were monuments of ambition, wealth, and pride, each mansion competing silently with the next, each compound carrying the language of success written in marble walls, tall gates, and glittering rooftops. In one of these houses stood the mansion of Mr. Peter Clark. It was not simply a home but a palace, its glass walls reflecting the morning sun with a brilliance that often made passers-by pause. The Clark residence was the kind of mansion that seemed almost untouchable, with its towering pillars, expansive gardens trimmed with perfection, and a fleet of exotic cars parked like ornaments in the vast driveway. Mr. Peter Clark was a rich business mogul, known across boardrooms for his shrewdness, wealth, and dominance. He was the kind of man others pointed to when speaking of success, the embodiment of what relentless ambition could achieve in a land where poverty fought hard to hold men down. Yet, inside that mansion of glory lived a quiet struggle that money could not silence. Mr. Clark had a daughter, MaryRose. She was a beautiful girl, her beauty the kind that was both effortless and disarming, with eyes that mirrored innocence and hair that shone in the light. She carried the grace of wealth in her steps, the polish of privilege in her manners. Yet behind that charm was a wound that grew larger with each passing year. She was not the smartest. MaryRose was the hope of her father's legacy, the one expected to rise in his footsteps and hold the empire of his business. Yet her grades told another story. She struggled in school, her books carrying battles she could never seem to win. While her peers excelled, answering questions with confidence and topping their classes, she sat quietly, her mind clouded with confusion whenever exams approached. She knew things, she read, she listened, but the moment ink touched paper, knowledge seemed to scatter like birds frightened by sudden thunder. Her teachers whispered behind her back. Her classmates mocked her silently, their laughter cutting through her heart. At home, the pressure mounted. Mr. Clark was a man who believed success should come naturally to his child, and each failure felt like an insult to his pride. He could not bear the embarrassment of having his friends boast about their children's brilliance, while his own daughter returned with shameful reports. Eventually, he withdrew her from the prestigious school where the children of his friends attended, just to avoid the humiliation of comparison. At night, MaryRose would hear the heavy weight of her parents' fights echoing through the mansion's walls. Her father's voice, sharp with anger, accused her mother of birthing a dull child. Her mother's voice, trembling yet defensive, carried pain as she tried to shield her daughter from blame. But the words cut deeper than any knife, and MaryRose, lying quietly on her bed, absorbed them in silence. She wanted to be smart. She wanted to please them. She tried her best, but her best was never enough. Slowly, her confidence withered like flowers starved of water. Her life became a cycle of failure and shame. Each time she moved to a new school, there was a fragile hope that perhaps things would change, that perhaps this time the environment would spark something in her. Yet the story repeated itself. Poor grades, humiliation, disappointment, and tears. Finally, her parents, exhausted by the endless shame, decided to send her away to a far boarding school. To them, it was a way of keeping her away from gossiping eyes, but to her it was exile. The mansion that should have been a haven became a prison of expectations she could not meet. While her father grew colder toward her, her mother, Madame Pat, grew restless. She masked her shame with pride, pretending in front of friends that all was well, while secretly battling her fears that her daughter might never live up to the Clark name. And in the middle of that polished mansion, MaryRose carried her burden alone, her laughter fading, her confidence broken, her eyes dimming each time the world demanded intelligence she could not give. The mansion glittered outside, but inside it held a young girl drowning quietly under the weight of her father's empire. The Clark mansion was large, so large that it always demanded more hands than a family could provide. The walls had to be polished daily so they would shine like the face of a mirror, the tiled floors needed scrubbing so they would remain spotless, and the chandeliers needed dusting so they would glow without a speck dimming their brilliance. For this reason, maids came and went, cleaners arrived and departed, gardeners bent their backs in the sun, and cooks filled the air with the scent of rich meals that only the wealthy could afford. Among these workers was a woman who looked fragile, but carried strength born from hardship. Her name was Mama Tobi. She came to the mansion quietly, broom and rag in hand, her back slightly bent from years of labor. Life had not been kind to her. She was a widow who had been left to raise a boy alone after her husband died of an illness that swallowed their little savings. Poverty became her closest companion, yet she fought to shield her son from the sharpest edges of hunger. She was not employed as a full-time maid. Instead, she was one of those women who are called occasionally, summoned to clean the rooms, sweep the corridors, and leave silently. She never overstayed her welcome, never spoke unless spoken to, and never lifted her eyes too high in the presence of Madame Pat. She had learned long ago that in houses of the wealthy, one survived best by being invisible. But she did not always come alone. Sometimes, especially during holidays, she brought her son, Tobi. He was a thin boy, his shoulders narrow beneath the weight of shirts that had lost their color to constant washing. His trousers were often patched in more places than one could count, and his sandals bore the scars of too many seasons. He did not look like he belonged in a mansion filled with gold and marble, yet there was something striking about him. His eyes carried an unusual sharpness, the kind of brightness that hunger could not dim. On one of those holidays, while Mama Tobi scrubbed the floors of the Clark mansion, Tobi wandered quietly around the compound, his curious eyes absorbing every detail. He had grown used to waiting patiently for his mother to finish her work, sitting in corners with silence as his only company. But on that day, something shifted. MaryRose was home for the holidays, withdrawn as usual, her books scattered across her room like soldiers fallen in battle. She had returned from school with another report card filled with red marks, and once again her parents' disappointment had wrapped around her like chains. She spent most of her hours alone, staring at pages that mocked her, words and numbers swimming before her eyes until they dissolved into meaninglessness. It was in that state that she first noticed him. Through the wide window of her room, she caught sight of the boy in torn clothes, sitting under the shade of a mango tree near the servants' quarters. He was not playing like other boys would have. Instead, he held a stick in his hand, scratching patterns on the sandy ground as if he were solving puzzles no one else could see. His movements were careful, deliberate, the kind that suggested he was not just passing time, but thinking. MaryRose watched him with curiosity. She had seen many workers in the mansion, many children of maids and drivers, but none had ever drawn her attention. Something about this boy's quietness made her pause. He seemed out of place and yet completely present, like a shadow that could not be ignored. Over the next few days, their paths crossed again. Sometimes, as she wandered in the garden to escape her books, she would find him there, humming softly to himself or arranging pebbles into shapes. Other times, when his mother took a break, he would walk near the fence, eyes fixed on the faraway streets beyond the estate, as though he were dreaming of a world larger than his poverty. Their first bond was not built with words, but with glances. She would look at him, and he would lower his eyes respectfully, but the next moment, curiosity would draw him to look again. Slowly, silently, something unspoken grew between them. It was the beginning of a hidden friendship, one that neither of them could explain, but both felt. Mama Tobi noticed it once or twice, the way her son's eyes lingered in the direction of the mansion's young heiress, but she said nothing. Life had already given her boy too many restrictions. She did not have the heart to place another wall around his heart. Madame Pat, however, was different. She noticed nothing at first, too occupied with social gatherings and the endless task of maintaining appearances. But time would reveal to her a closeness she could not tolerate, a bond she would despise simply because it crossed the invisible lines that divided the rich from the poor. For now, though, MaryRose and Toby remained two children from two worlds, circling each other quietly in the shadows of the mansion, unaware that destiny had already begun to weave their stories together. The days in the Clark mansion were marked by routine, the kind of routine that wealth built. Meals served on polished silver trays, rooms perfumed with the scent of imported flowers, and the endless silence of hallways too wide for comfort. For MaryRose, those routines had grown heavy, pressing down on her young heart with the weight of expectations she could not meet. Books surrounded her like prison walls, and her mind stumbled over letters and numbers as though they were stones placed deliberately to trip her. But in the midst of her struggles, Toby became a quiet presence that drew her like a flame draws a moth. At first, it was curiosity. She would watch him from a distance, noticing how he handled little things with a sharpness that her teachers, with all their training, never displayed. He would pick up sticks and carve shapes in the sand, balancing them into patterns that seemed too deliberate to be play. He arranged stones in neat rows, counting them with precision. He studied ants on the ground, following their trails, and seemed to understand a rhythm in their movements that no one else noticed. One afternoon, while her books sat open before her in yet another losing battle, she found herself drifting toward the garden. Toby was there, crouched over a patch of earth with a stick in hand. He was sketching numbers in the soil, writing them with the ease of someone who had done so countless times. She paused, hidden by the shadows of the mango tree, and watched. He added lines and marks, solving a problem in the sand, as though the ground were his chalkboard. She recognized some of the numbers. They were the same ones that mocked her in class. But on the earth, scratched by the hand of a poor boy, they looked less frightening. It was in moments like that their bond began. Slowly, MaryRose drew nearer, asking no questions but watching more boldly. He noticed her one day, standing with eyes fixed on his work, and though his instinct was to retreat, something held him there. He pointed at the numbers, then at her open book, as though telling her silently that they were the same. She looked, confused at first, then surprised as the connection settled into her mind. Without words, he showed her what her teachers had failed to explain. Their friendship grew in the quiet corners of the mansion, hidden from eyes that would not approve. They met under the mango tree, in the garden paths, and sometimes in the servants' quarters when no one was looking. He would take her books, flipping the pages with hands that bore calluses from hardship, and show her lessons in ways so simple they seemed almost magical. If a word confused her, he broke it into parts. If a number frightened her, he shaped it with objects around them, pebbles, sticks, or even leaves. With patience born not of wealth but of survival, he guided her mind through the labyrinth of learning. For MaryRose, the change was like light breaking through clouds. For the first time, lessons made sense. She began to solve problems she once thought impossible. Letters and numbers no longer mocked her. They began to bow to her understanding. She felt a new strength stir within her, a confidence that grew each time Toby's sharp mind unveiled another secret of learning. But beyond academics, there was something deeper. In Toby's company, she did not feel the crushing weight of her father's expectations or the sting of her mother's pride. She felt human, free, unjudged. He treated her not as the rich man's daughter, but as a girl with potential, a friend who could learn. That acceptance, so rare in her world, became the soil in which her confidence blossomed. Mama Toby watched with quiet eyes. She saw how her son returned from the mansion each day, his face brighter, his spirit lifted. She saw how MaryRose followed him with her gaze, when she thought no one was watching. She understood what was happening, yet she said nothing. Life had taught her that some bonds were beyond rules, and she did not have the power to stop what destiny had already begun to weave. But Madame Pat, MaryRose's mother, began to notice changes as well. Her daughter, once buried in failure, began to answer questions more confidently. She began to show signs of sharpness, her grades improving slightly, her posture carrying less shame. At first, Madame Pat was relieved. She believed the expensive tutors were finally yielding results. But one afternoon, When she found her daughter laughing softly near the garden in the company of the maid's son, her relief turned into anger. The sight unsettled her. To her, wealth was a fortress that must never be breached by those outside it. She did not mind MaryRose improving, but the thought that her progress was tied to a ragged boy in torn clothes was unbearable. In her heart, class stood taller than kindness. She began to warn her daughter subtly, reminding her of who she was and the difference between their worlds. She masked her fear in polite words, but inside she boiled with disdain. Still, MaryRose could not let go. The improvement in her studies was real, and so was the comfort she found in Tobi's quiet strength. She hid their friendship more carefully, but she did not abandon it. She knew, even if she could not say it aloud, that Tobi was her lifeline. And so, in the hidden corners of the Clark mansion, away from the gaze of wealth and pride, a poor boy and a rich girl built a friendship that no one could have predicted. What began as curiosity was becoming something greater, a lifeline for her and, though he did not yet know it, a doorway to a future he could not have imagined. Time moved in seasons within the Clark mansion. Each holiday came with its own rhythm. Each school term carried its own tension, and every report card returned with its share of relief or disappointment. But this time, something had changed. MaryRose was no longer the timid girl who sat in class, unable to grasp even the simplest of lessons. She began to write answers more confidently. Her teachers began to notice sparks of brilliance where there had once been only shadows. Though she was not suddenly at the top of her class, the steady improvement was undeniable. She began to pass subjects she had failed repeatedly, and her scores, though still modest, carried upward growth that even the most critical eye could not ignore. At home, the difference was more visible. She no longer locked herself away in shame after school hours. Her books, once her tormentors, became companions she opened more eagerly. She moved through the mansion with a lighter step, her confidence slowly piecing itself back together. For the first time in years, hope returned to her eyes. Mr. Peter Clark noticed. He was not a man who gave compliments easily, but he was a man of results, and results spoke louder to him than anything else. He studied his daughter with the sharpness of a businessman watching an investment turn around. He noticed the way she now faced her work without fear, the way she began to answer his questions without trembling. His interest grew, and though he did not yet know the source of the transformation, he was relieved. The truth revealed itself one afternoon. Mr. Clark had returned home earlier than usual, his steps echoing through the polished marble halls. As he walked through the garden, he paused at the sound of voices carried softly by the breeze. He turned and saw a sight that rooted him to the ground. There, under the wide mango tree, sat MaryRose with her books spread before her. Beside her, with his shirt faded and his sandals worn thin, sat Tobi. The boy's finger traced numbers on a page, his lips moving as he explained patiently, while MaryRose leaned forward, her eyes wide with attention. It was a picture so unusual that Mr. Clark stood in silence, watching. At first he was surprised. Then, slowly, admiration settled in his heart. The boy, though poor, carried himself with quiet intelligence. His methods were unpolished, but they worked. He saw his daughter's face, alive, alert, hungry to learn, and in that moment, Mr. Clark knew the boy was the reason for her change. A thought crossed his mind, a thought that humbled even his pride. Perhaps intelligence was not always bought with money. Perhaps wisdom was not always clothed in fine suits or carried in the halls of expensive schools. Perhaps it could dwell in the heart of a ragged boy with nothing to his name but brilliance. From that day, Mr. Clark regarded Tobi differently. He did not dismiss him as just the maid's son. He began to see him as an asset, a boy worth watching. Though he said nothing to disrupt their meetings, he encouraged it subtly, asking fewer questions when he saw them together, offering a nod of approval when MaryRose's grades improved again. But while the father's heart softened, the mother's heart hardened. Madame Pat had always been a woman of pride, her life built on appearances and social standing. She prided herself on the mansion she kept, the friends she entertained, and the wealth she displayed. To her, class was not just a difference, it was a wall that must never be crossed. When she noticed her husband's silent approval of the boy, her disdain grew into bitterness. She saw danger where others saw hope. To her, Mary Rose's reliance on a boy in torn clothes was a stain, an embarrassment she could not tolerate. She imagined the whispers of her friends if they ever found out that her daughter, heir to the Clark name, was being taught by a maid's son. Jealousy, sharp and poisonous, began to eat at her. She despised the way her daughter's eyes lit up in Toby's presence, the way her husband's gaze softened with approval each time he saw the boy. She told herself it was not hatred, but protection. She believed she was shielding her family's dignity, when in truth, she was guarding her pride. And so, while Mary Rose blossomed quietly under Toby's guidance, Madame Pat began to scheme. She watched them closely, her heart burning with resentment, her mind crafting ways to separate them. She could not yet strike openly, but the seed of jealousy had taken root, and soon it would bear fruit. In the Clark mansion, two forces had begun to shape Mary Rose's life: her father's favor, which welcomed the poor boy's influence, and her mother's jealousy, which sought to destroy it. Between them, destiny was sharpening its blade, preparing to cut open the future that none of them could yet see. The mansion seemed peaceful, its glittering windows reflecting sunlight as though nothing could disturb its perfection. Yet beneath that brightness, seeds of envy and pride were ripening into bitterness. Madame Pat had watched long enough, and each passing day fueled her determination. In her eyes, the poor boy's presence was not simply an irritation, it was a threat. She believed that if she allowed him to remain close to her daughter, the family name would be dragged into the mud. Her disapproval, once silent, began to grow more obvious. She scolded Mary Rose subtly, urging her to focus on her tutors, reminding her that associating with servants would not lift her to greatness. But the girl's stubbornness unsettled her. No matter how much she tried to separate them, Mary Rose always found her way back to the boy's side. Each new improvement in her daughter's studies was like a thorn in Madame Pat's flesh, for she knew the source of that success was not the expensive teachers she had hired, but the ragged son of a maid. Anger became her constant companion. It whispered to her in the quiet of the night, mocking her pride and daring her to act. Finally, she decided she could bear it no longer. If her daughter would not walk away from the boy, then she would remove him completely. The plan was simple, but cruel. She would brand him a thief, for in the houses of the wealthy, nothing stained a servant's reputation more quickly than the shadow of theft. She waited for the right moment, patient like a hunter watching prey. It came one afternoon when Mr. Clark was away on business, and the mansion carried its usual hum of activity. Madame Pat called for her jewelry box, one of her prized possessions filled with ornaments that glittered like captured stars. After handling them, she left the box carelessly on a table near the corridor. But her carelessness was deliberate. Within minutes, she slipped a bracelet into Toby's small bag when no one was watching, her hands trembling with a mix of fear and determination. Later, when she called for the jewelry box again, her voice rang through the house with rehearsed alarm. The bracelet was missing. The mansion erupted in confusion as maids and workers scurried nervously, their hearts pounding with dread. In such households, an accusation of theft was not a small matter. It was a storm that could sweep away reputations and lives. It did not take long before her eyes turned toward Toby. She demanded his bag be searched, and when the bracelet was found inside, gasps filled the air. The poor boy froze in shock, his face pale with disbelief. His mother, Mama Toby, fell to her knees, her hands trembling as she tried to explain that her son would never steal. But words fell on deaf ears. To Madame Pat, her plan had succeeded. The evidence was clear to all who watched. The boy was a thief. Workers shook their heads in pity, some too afraid to speak, others convinced that poverty had driven him to shame. Toby tried to protest, but his voice carried no weight in a mansion where his torn clothes had already spoken louder than his innocence. Mary Rose was devastated. She stood frozen, her heart screaming against what her eyes saw. She wanted to defend him. to declare that the boy who had patiently guided her through books could never stoop so low. But fear sealed her lips. The weight of her mother's authority crushed her courage, and all she could do was watch as the boy who had been her lifeline was branded a thief before her eyes. When Mr. Clark returned and heard of the theft, his disappointment was deep. He had begun to admire the boy, but trust was fragile in the world of the wealthy. Though he said little, his silence was consent to his wife's judgment. By evening, Mama Toby and her son were sent away from the mansion in shame. Their belongings, few and humble, were bundled into worn bags, and the heavy gates of the estate closed behind them with finality. For MaryRose, their departure was like the sun being snatched from the sky. Her books once again became enemies, her lessons returned to confusion, and her spirit sank deeper than before. The boy who had shown her that she could rise above failure was gone, and with him went the light of her confidence. In the weeks that followed, her grades plunged with alarming speed. She struggled harder than ever, but her mind refused to cooperate. The whispers in school grew louder, the shame heavier. She withdrew into herself, her laughter gone, her eyes clouded with a loneliness that no wealth could heal. Madame Pat, though victorious in her scheme, found no joy in her triumph. Her daughter's decline became obvious, and whispers of failure returned to haunt the mansion. Yet her pride would not let her admit fault. She told herself it was temporary, that MaryRose would recover without the poor boy's influence. But deep within, she knew the truth, that she had cut away the one branch that had begun to bear fruit. The mansion glittered as always, but its brightness could not hide the shadows that had fallen inside. A bond had been broken, a boy unjustly condemned, and a girl left once again to drown in the weight of expectations she could not meet. And somewhere beyond the estate walls, Toby and his mother walked into the uncertain night, carrying the pain of a stain they could not wash away. The days that followed Toby's expulsion from the Clark mansion were heavy with silence. The wide hallways that once carried the faint laughter of MaryRose now echoed only with the emptiness of her footsteps. She had withdrawn into herself, her books once again spread open before her but remaining untouched, her pen lying idle in her hand as though it had lost its purpose. The sharpness that had begun to bloom in her had vanished overnight. Without Toby's patient guidance, her lessons turned back into a blur of confusion. Numbers slipped away from her mind, words entangled themselves in knots she could not untie. She sat in classrooms unable to answer even the simplest of questions, her teachers shaking their heads in disappointment, her classmates whispering cruelly behind her back. Her grades plummeted faster than anyone expected. The improvement that had once surprised her teachers became a fleeting memory, replaced by failure so sharp it seemed to mock the brief hope she had carried. At home, she grew quieter. She stopped smiling, stopped engaging, stopped even trying to convince herself that she could do better. Each evening, she retreated into her room, staring at her books until her eyes blurred with tears she dared not let anyone see. Mr. Clark noticed. He was a man who did not miss details, and the decline of his daughter's performance struck him like a blow. The pride he had begun to feel when she showed signs of progress quickly turned to shame once again. Reports from her school painted a grim picture. She was failing, and failing badly. The tension in the mansion grew. Mr. Clark's patience thinned, his voice sharp each time he addressed his wife. He demanded answers, demanded to know why his daughter's sudden improvement had disappeared without explanation. He had noticed before that her progress was tied to the presence of the maid's son, and though he had kept quiet, he now began to piece the puzzle together. Madame Pat lived in denial. She told herself she had done the right thing, that removing the boy had been necessary to protect her family's dignity. But the truth gnawed at her with every passing day. She could not escape the reality that her daughter was sinking, and she alone had opened the pit. The breaking point came one afternoon when MaryRose returned from school with a report card so devastating it could not be ignored. Every subject carried failure. Every grade sank below the mark of hope. She stood before her father with trembling hands, the paper slipping from her grasp as tears filled her eyes. For the first time, she did not even try to defend herself. She simply stood in silence, her head bowed, her spirit crushed. Mr. Clark exploded in anger. His words were sharp, his disappointment thunderous. He turned to his wife, his eyes burning with questions that demanded answers. He asked why their daughter had once improved and then fallen apart so suddenly. He asked why the boy who had been a quiet influence in the mansion was suddenly gone. His voice carried suspicion, and though Madame Pat tried to meet it with defiance, her strength faltered. That night, the house was heavy with silence. Madame Pat lay awake, the weight of her secret pressing down on her chest. Pride had guided her actions, but pride could not save her daughter from the darkness she had fallen into. The image of Toby's face, when the bracelet was found, haunted her. The memory of Mama Toby's trembling pleas replayed in her mind. And in the brokenness of her daughter, she saw the cost of her cruelty. Finally, she broke. With trembling lips and a heart heavy with guilt, she confessed to her husband. She admitted the theft had been a lie, a scheme born of jealousy and pride. She confessed she had planted the bracelet in the boy's bag, knowing it would condemn him. She admitted she could not bear to watch her daughter depend on the son of a maid, and in her arrogance, she had destroyed the very hope MaryRose had found. The confession struck the mansion like lightning. Mr. Clark's anger was deep, his disappointment in his wife heavier than any words could carry. But beyond his anger was the pain of realizing the truth. Their daughter's lifeline had been cut off by the very hand meant to protect her. MaryRose, though young, understood enough. She wept silently as the truth reached her ears. She knew now that Toby's disgrace had not been his fault. She knew her mother's pride had stolen her only chance at rising. The knowledge burned inside her, filling her with both relief and sorrow. Relief that the boy she had trusted had not betrayed her. Sorrow that he had been cast out unjustly, and she had been too afraid to defend him. The Clark mansion, with all its wealth and glitter, had become a house of shame. For the first time, Madame Pat saw her pride for what it was, a chain that had bound her family to destruction. Her heart, once hardened by class and status, began to soften under the weight of her guilt. But confession alone could not heal the wound. The boy was gone, cast out with his mother, their names stained by the falsehood she had created. If redemption was to come, it would demand more than words. It would demand humility, acceptance, and the courage to bring back those she had wronged. And so, in the quiet of the night, Madame Pat resolved that she would do what she had never imagined. She would seek out the maid and her son, not as servants, but as family. The morning after Madame Pat's confession, the mansion seemed different. The chandeliers still sparkled, the curtains still hung in graceful folds, the marble floors still shone, but beneath the glitter was a heavy silence. For once, wealth could not hide the cracks in the Clark family. Mr. Clark, a man known for his pride as much as his success, was restless. He had barely slept, his mind tormented by the truth. His daughter's failure, his wife's betrayal, the injustice done to an innocent boy, all weighed upon him. He had built his empire on discipline and fairness, yet under his roof, a great wrong had been committed. MaryRose sat at the edge of her bed, her eyes swollen from tears. In her small hands, she clutched the same pen Toby had once placed there during a lesson, his gentle voice urging her to try again. Those two words now echoed in her heart with unbearable force. Try again. But how could she, when the only person who had believed in her had been cast out in disgrace? Madame Pat moved about like a shadow. Guilt had carved lines into her face, softening the sharpness of her beauty. She could no longer look her daughter in the eye. The memory of Toby's innocence, his quiet humility, and the desperate pleas of his mother haunted her every step. Finally, Mr. Clark broke the silence. His decision was firm. The boy and his mother had to be found and brought back. Not as servants to be tolerated, but as people whose dignity had to be restored. The search was not easy. Toby and his mother had vanished into the crowded streets of the city, taking shelter in a poor neighborhood far from the glittering estates. Their life had returned to hardship, Mama Toby washing clothes for pennies, Toby running errands to help keep them afloat. Yet in their struggle, there was a strange dignity. They bore their suffering quietly, with the resilience of those who had known pain before. When the Clark driver finally appeared at their door, Mama Toby's heart trembled. Fear gripped her. Had they come to cast more insults? Had her son's name not suffered enough? But when she was told that Madame Pat herself sought forgiveness, she fell silent. She could hardly believe it. The return to the Clark mansion was heavy with emotion. As Mama Toby stepped through the grand gates, memories of shame flooded back. The day she had been accused, the day she had been thrown out. Her steps were hesitant, her head bowed low. Toby walked beside her, his young face carrying the quiet strength of one who had endured injustice. Inside, the Clark family awaited them. MaryRose was the first to move. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she ran to Toby and clung to him. Her words were broken by sobs, but her heart spoke clearly. She was sorry. She knew now he had never betrayed her trust. Madame Pat stood back, her body trembling. The weight of pride made it hard to step forward, but at last she did. She fell to her knees before Mama Toby, a gesture that shocked everyone in the room. With tears streaming down her face, she confessed fully, her voice breaking with each word. She begged for forgiveness, not just for herself, but for the wound she had caused her daughter and the stain she had placed upon an innocent boy. Mama Toby, though hurt deeply, could not harden her heart. She had known too much pain in life to hold on to bitterness. In a voice soft but firm, she forgave. Not because the wound was small, but because she understood that forgiveness was the only path forward. The atmosphere in the mansion shifted. What had once been a house divided by pride became a place touched by humility. Mr. Clark, though stern, promised that Toby's education would be sponsored fully. He declared openly that the boy would no longer be seen as the maid's son, but as a child with a future, deserving of every opportunity. For MaryRose, it was as though a veil had been lifted from her heart. With Toby back, she felt her hope return. The lessons resumed, and though her journey was still difficult, she no longer faced it alone. Every evening, she and Toby bent over her books, their heads close, their pens scratching against paper, determination shining in their young eyes. And for Madame Pat, redemption was not instant. It was a journey. She had to live each day with the memory of her failure, but also with the chance to rebuild what she had broken. For the first time, she looked at Mama Toby not as a servant, but as a sister in life's struggles. The barriers of class that once blinded her began to fall away. The Clark mansion, once stained by pride and injustice, began to breathe again. Wealth still filled its rooms, but now humility and forgiveness added a fragrance that money could not buy. And in the quiet of the night, as Toby's voice patiently guided MaryRose through her stumbling lessons, the family began to heal, one word, one number, one act of forgiveness at a time.